They say the color of peace is white. In Benin, it is ground into a fine chalk orhue pressed onto brow and wrist to seal a promise older than any king. Now imagine that white on an open palm in Akure's palace courtyard, sunlight on coral beads, the murmured blessing of a new reign. Then a scream cuts through the ceremony, and the chalk spills like ash onto red earth. If a single symbol can turn a continent, this is the moment. A blessing curdles. A road between two cities, Benin City and Akure, shifts from gifts to grudges. And somewhere behind a curtain, someone counts the Oba's coral with a covetous eye. Before we name the knife, sit with the stakes. In the late 1810 seconds, the Benin Kingdom is no fading memory. It is weight, ritual, and reach. Oba Osemwende, newly seated after 1816, inherits more than a stool. He inherits a web of allegiance held together by recognitions and rights. One right matters above all for a tributary town: the arrival of an envoy carrying orhue and the words that affirm the bond. In Akure, this ceremony is not exotic. It happens in seasons like rain. Men exchange prayers. The Deji Arákàlẹ answers in kind. Drums mark the rhythm of continuity. But bonds fray long before they snap. The markets have been talking. An Edo trader roughed in Akure. Smoke and shouting at Igbara Odo. Stalls torched, tempers let loose. You can call these incidents local. You can call them accidents. Empires don't. An insult to traders today is a rehearsal for an insult to envoys tomorrow. So when Osemwende chooses patience, let passions cool, then send chalk, it isn't weakness, it's calculation. He knows the throne is only as safe as its messengers. Picture the procession that follows. An experienced courtier, Chief Oseg, moving under parasols, the bowl of orhue at the center like a small moon. On his chest sits power you can touch. Ivy coral, heavy and luminous. At his neck an odigbatorque that speaks without words. Bead armlets and anklets that turn every step into an announcement. In this world, regalia is not decoration. It is the grammar of rank. It tells a city exactly who is standing in its courtyard. And for a moment, the old choreography holds. The Deji reaches, chalk brushes skin. The blessing is spoken. The crowd exhales. The road that links Benin City to Akure feels familiar again, as if the roughness of recent months could be smoothed by protocol alone. But ceremonies have shadows. A watching face in the crowd is less interested in the bond between kingdoms than in the coral gleaming 2 paces away. Desire creeps easily where honor is tired. We will not leap ahead. We will not name the body yet. What matters here is the why that coils around the what. Why does an empire entrust its voice to a man in coral? Because the envoy embodies legitimacy itself. Why does a city accept a ritual even when pride stings? Because to refuse is to announce rebellion without an army. And why does one night's chaos, one quarrel gone wrong, one hand too bold detonate so completely? Because in Benin law and memory, to stain orhue is to stain the king. You do not bruise the breath of a sovereign and expect the dawn to be gentle. Listen closely to the landscape just before the break. The road from the oil palms into Akure's gates hums with small trade. Children chase one another past courtyards. Smiths beat a rhythm on iron that has nothing to do with war. Yet there is a second rhythm underneath chiefs in Benin City murmuring counsel to Osemwende. Akure's elders whispering about dignity and dependence. Markets comparing rumors like prices. It is the kind of quiet that doesn't last. The kind that makes you lean toward the screen because you can feel, in your bones, that one more gesture, one misstep, one insult to the wrong symbol will force everyone to reveal who they really are. This is where our story begins, with a white powder meant to heal and a red earth that remembers everything. With an Oba who would rather measure his reply than rush to it. With a Deji who will soon discover that some trophies cost more than a throne. With a city that believes walls can outlast fury. And with commanders who have not yet been summoned but already feel the weight of iron settling into their hands. If you want more African power stories told with care and fire hidden histories, ruthless decisions, and the tactics that shaped them, subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring the next chapter to life, and trust me, you'll want to see how this one ends. Before we move, a question to test your instincts. Drop your answer in the comments. A. If an envoy is harmed during a ritual visit, should a ruler pause for diplomacy and sanctions first? B. Or should a ruler treat it as an attack on the throne and answer with immediate force? Comment A or B, and tell us why. Night fell on Akure the way a verdict falls quietly at first, then with the weight of consequence. Torches guttered along the palace colonnade. The courtyards exhaled the last warmth of the day. In a guest compound off the main yard, Chief Oseg rinsed the chalk dust from his hands and set aside the covered bowl of orhue. The ceremony had been formal, the words correctly spoken. He had eaten sparingly, accepted a calabash of water, and instructed his attendants to sleep in shifts. An envoy's safety is never an accident. It is a web of habit. Yet beyond the reed fence, a different set of habits stirred ones that belonged to markets after dark, to pride stung by ceremony, to a city that had pushed its luck with empire and decided it could push again. The story of what happened next lives in two voices that refused to agree. In one, a woman from Osage's household stepped out to buy tobacco, and a man in the lane reached where his hands had no right to be. The quarrel spat sparks, shouts against the wall, a flash of steel, the envoy stepping forward to pull his own from the snare, and then the blow that should never have been struck. In the other voice, nothing was accidental. A provocation was laid like kindling. Lewd words, a shove meant to force a response, a cluster of men who were waiting for that first step into the alley. Whichever you trust, the end is the same. Oseg fell, and a silence, awful and intimate, closed around the body of the Oba's voice in a foreign yard. Word runs faster at night. Palace guards arrived before the dust settled. Akure's elders were woken. The Deji Arákàlẹ was called from his sleeping room. He came with a lamp and a face set to neutral, the way rulers wear their fear. He looked at the envoy, at the bowl of chalk now spattered with soil, at the coral gleaming on a chest that would never rise again. Protocol demands immediate contrition, secure the compound, send couriers at once to Benin City, place the guilty under arrest, guard the regalia untouched until dawn. Instead, the decision that would damn him slid, unspoken, into the room. The ivy coral would not travel back to Benin. The odigba at the envoy's throat would not leave Akure. Whether Arákàlẹ ordered the seizure or merely did nothing as eager hands unfastened the pieces, traditions disagree. But coral changed ownership that night, and with it, the meaning of the evening. A man lay dead. Now a symbol did too. To Edo memory, this is the hinge. An envoy's body can be mourned. His regalia cannot be stolen. In Benin law, the ambassador carries the sovereign's breath. To bruise him is to bruise the throne. To strip him is to drag the throne into the street. In Akure's palace, other calculations uncoiled. A ruler who has promised roads and markets cannot appear weak before his own chiefs. If he sends the coral back with apologies, what story will the town tell of him at sunrise? Pride seldom asks better questions than power does. The runners reached Oba Osemwende before dawn. They knelt on the threshold of the private court while the bronze lamps were still being lit and recited what they knew. The ritual completed. A quarrel, death in a side lane. The taking of coral. The Oba did not curse. He asked for names, for the exact hour, for whether the orhue had touched the Deji's skin before or after the blow, details that seem petty until you remember that legitimacy in Benin is a matter of sequence and sign. He sent a senior priest to order the rites for a courtier who dies on duty. Then he sent for war. 3 men entered the audience room whose names would carry this night into history: the Izomo, the Ologbozere, and Imaran. Osemwende did not need to raise his voice. The titles do their own work. He spoke of law, not rage. He spoke of the untouchable nature of a messenger's person, of the older violence at Igbara Odo, of markets made unsafe, and the insult that follows when a city keeps what never belonged to it. The command he gave was cold with clarity. This would not be a raid, but a punishment shaped by rule. Akure would feel the difference between a brawl and a verdict. Before they withdrew to make preparations, the Oba kept them a moment longer. He asked the Izomo what a city fears most, hunger or humiliation. He asked the Ologbozere what breaks a wall faster, iron or doubt. He asked Imaran what a commander should protect first, his honor or his men. Their answers did not survive to ink, but the questions tell you what kind of campaign Osemwende intended. You don't push a flame into a thatch roof because you are angry. You do it because it is the most efficient way to change a skyline. Back in Akure, the Deji's council sat pale in the first light. Some urged immediate messengers with gifts and grief. Others, hot with local pride, insisted the envoy had overreached, that accidents happen, that Benin would not trade a man for a war. Arákàlẹ listened, his fingers worrying a bead he had no right to hold, and chose the path that preserves a face at home and forfeits it abroad. By noon, the envoy's household was preparing the body. By evening, the first rumors had slipped through the riverine paths that lead to every town that owes Benin a debt. The news carried two truths: a messenger had died, and the ivy had not been returned. If the night of the envoy was a wound, the morning after was the pulse that proves it is still bleeding. Osemwende's scribes sealed orders for the provinces. Drums at the outer gate beat a pattern that wakes garrisons. The court filled with the dry rasp of leather being checked, the serious laughter of men who know they will march, the quiet efficiency of a state switching from ceremony to consequence. No one spoke of rage. In the annals that matter, rage is a bad strategist. Law, on the other hand, is inexhaustible. It remembers everything, and it walks on 2 feet. Campaigns that endure are drawn before they are fought. In Benin City, the plan that answered Akure was sketched not in fury but in lines of movement and points of pressure. Oba Osemwende gave 3 names the authority to turn that design into ground truth: the Izomo, the Ologbozere, and Imaran. Each would carry a different edge of the same blade. Ahead of them, like fingertips feeling the texture of the land, went 2 seasoned front leaders, Imade and Oyodo, sent to find the paths that could carry an army and to close the paths that could carry a plea for help. The country between Benin City and Akure is a conversation of ridges and lowland farms, streambeds and red tracks that crisp under dry wind. Imade's scouts moved first, listening more than speaking, counting hearth fires, measuring how quickly a village doused its lamps at the rumor of bronze bells, noting where a grove hid a side path broad enough for a cart. Behind them came porters with powder and shot, leather water skins, spare axles for gun carriages, smiths who could shoe a problem as quickly as a horse, priests who knew the small rites that keep men from prejudging the outcome of a battle. An army that reaches its target intact is not brave by accident. It is obedient to logistics. Routes and sequencing grow blurry in the stories told later. Some insist the Ezomo's column led along the Okalisa, divided by Okalisa corridor, while the Ologbozere paralleled that thrust. Others place the heavier guns with Imaran, as he angled toward Isinkan. What the versions agree upon is intent. This would not be a straight punch. It would be a noose woven of roads. The ring would be set wide at first, its cords anchored on water points, markets, and the lanes a messenger would use if he woke to panic at midnight. When a city cannot call for help, its walls become less a shield than a promise of exhaustion. Akure felt the change before it saw the enemy. A trader on the Edo-Ekiti road passed a checkpoint that had not existed the day before, men with discipline in their eyes and no interest in barter. A woman fetching water from a stream found a picket on the far bank. Drums from the outlying farmsteads sounded patterns that had nothing to do with dance. Within the walls, the Deji Arákàle's captains counted arrows and gourds of grain, placed watchers on the palace roof, and decided which gate would be the last to open if everything failed. Defense can be crisp in the morning. By afternoon, it becomes arithmetic. On the periphery, the first tests came quick and without drama. A sortie from Akure's fields probed a bend near Isinkan and found a disciplined refusal. No hot pursuit, no bait laid carelessly. Just a line that stepped back 2 paces and then no farther. Elsewhere, a barricade of felled trees appeared overnight on a feeder track. By noon, Imade's men had cut a clean gap through it and posted a hornblower who treated every approaching footfall like a message. The ring did not tighten in a rush. It settled, the way weight settles, and the soundscape changed. Fewer carts on the approaches, fewer children's voices beyond the gardens. Then none at all. When the commanders judged the circle strong enough to hold itself, they began the second act of the design. Field guns, some say a handful, others more, were brought forward and sighted where elevation could add its arithmetic to iron. Gun teams tested their wedges and trails, sighted along rooflines rather than hopes. Powder was husbanded, shot stacked where it could be reached without panic. The Ologbozere's veterans, remembering other towns and other years, tamped charges with a slowness born of contempt for accidents. There is a dignity to careful violence that terrifies more than rage. At Isolo, the land offers angles you can use if you are patient. A ridge overlooks a cluster of compounds linked by shared walls. A courtyard becomes a conduit if you take the corner from the right distance. The first report was not meant to break stone, it was meant to break courage. The ball struck, dust breathed out of a parapet, and the men on the wall flinched at the way impact carries its own silence behind it. The second shot landed where the first had spoken, and now a section sagged in a language any defender understands. You can hold a breach with heroes. You cannot hold 3. Encirclement is a force that works even when it sleeps. While the guns trained their argument on the visible edge, the rest of the ring did quieter work. Runners who tried to slip out toward Igbara Odo met a net of listening posts set at earshot distance apart. A small convoy of grain was turned without blood, a gesture as cold as steel because it said, without words, that hunger had become a policy. The Izomo did not need to hurry the guns if the arithmetic of supplies would do his speaking for him. Imiran, on the opposite axis, kept his men close to ground and closer to orders, refusing the temptation to storm a gate simply because it was there. A multi-axis assault breaks a defender's capacity to redeploy. It does not begin with noise. It begins with denial. Within Akure, the calculus shifted from defiant to careful. Captains argued for a night attack to spike the guns, but night belongs to the side that has already mapped every path to the battery. To reach a cannon, you have to step through space someone has already thought about. Arákàlẹ walked the palace interior twice, then a third time, and gave orders that placed oil and water far from flame. The city still believed in its walls. Belief has a taste like iron on the tongue, useful until it turns into metal you cannot chew. When the time came to align shock with shape, the three columns behaved the way they had been drawn, not as rivals racing for a gate, but as teeth closing around the same bite. Drums carried a pattern across the ring, then stopped. Silence travels faster than sound when men have been taught what silence means. The guns raised their muzzles a finger's breadth. The infantry shifted up to a mark they had paced off in daylight. Horn calls stitched edges together that had not seen each other since the march began. A city can survive a single blow that lands brilliantly in the wrong place. It does not survive a set of blows that land exactly where they were meant to. Some accounts insist the Ezomo's men stepped first, others that the Ologbozere's shot opened the seam at Isolo before any advance. The lesson is the same, whichever detail you favor. Encirclement is not the prelude to an assault. It is the assault, spread across time. By the hour that followed, Akure was no longer a city deciding how to fight. It was a geography being rewritten. And, on the map the commanders carried in their heads, one more line was about to be drawn, the line that leads from a broken quarter to a palace that has not yet understood what it means to be the last sentence in a campaign. The wall did not fall all at once. It learned the language of collapse in pieces. First a shiver through the parapeted Isolo, then the startled recoil of men who had never felt stone answer like a living thing. The Ologbozere's gunners did not shout. They breathed, tamped, and spoke to the gun as if to an animal that must be respected to obey. The third report was closer, deeper, and when the dust settled, a corner had slumped into itself with the tiredness of a structure that has kept faith too long. Courage is elastic until it hears masonry sigh. Then it remembers it was always a muscle. Inside, Akure felt the change as a temperature, not a sound. Orders that had been spoken in full sentences shortened to gestures. Courtyards that had thrummed with the defender's bravado went careful and thin. The Deji Arákàlẹ walked the inner corridors of the palace and put his palm to posts that had outlived fathers and sons. He understood that a palace is a skin, and when the city's outer nerves are cut, the skin becomes the only truth left. He ordered drums to keep time on the roof, not for prayer but to stitch together the men whose thoughts were already loosening. Somewhere beyond the inner gate, a mother hid her calabash in the ashes, the old instinct to save a future no one can see. The Izomo did not hurry the ring. Encirclement does its best work when the enemy believes a reprieve is near. The Imiran kept his axis steady and untheatrical, pushing skirmishers into alleys and backing them out again before a counterstroke could form. The pattern, the one drawn in Benin City, tightened to its last loop. Then discipline did what rage cannot. Infantry stepped forward to markers they had paced in daylight. The guns rose a finger's breadth to kiss the lip of a breach, horns stitched right to left and left to right, so that separate columns felt like a single hand closing on a jar. At the palace edge, the first ball struck high, as if to warn. The second took timber that mattered. The third was not loud. It was persuasive. Rafters shook. Dust breathed. A row of clay jars shivered against one another with the small, embarrassed music things make when they are dying. A guard whose father had guarded before him flinched at a sound that was not the impact, but the decision inside him responding to it. Walls are architecture until they are psychology. Then they are either history or air. When the breach yawned wide enough to name, alleys became logic. The Ologbozere's veterans moved not like men entering a prize, but like men entering a legal argument that must be proven step by measured step. A punitive expedition is theater for those who watch, and law for those who execute. No storming to glory, no racing for plunder, just lanes cleared, courtyards crossed, thresholds owned. Cattle were driven off with the same administrative efficiency a clerk might use to inventory tribute. Those taken were counted, not whooped over. It is a colder kind of fear to be conquered by people who do not need to be excited to conquer you. The Deji felt the last thread go. He sent for the small chest where he kept the tokens of his fathers, and then he left by the gate he had planned to leave by if this hour ever came. Toward Akure, first the Iwi's town, because history teaches that kinship sometimes outruns caution. Not this morning. Prudence rarely opens its door to a man whose pursuers keep good time. Refused, he turned toward Uhen. Smaller, quieter, and he told himself less visible. But an encirclement is not a circle on a map. It is a kind of attention. The ruler of Uhen had already measured the cost of harboring a man whose enemies carry drums that do not lose their beat. At dawn, word went to the Ezomo. By mid-morning, spears ringed the compound like numbers closing in on an answer. He surrendered without theater. There is a dignity to the way some men lower their eyes, not to beg, but to meet an inevitability with fewer witnesses. In the tribunal that followed, the argument was as old as empires. In Benin memory, an envoy carries the Oba Osemwende's breath. To wound him is to bruise the sovereign's face. To strip his ivy and Odigba is to drag the throne into the street. Law is not a mood. It is a ladder by which states climb out of the chaos of grievance. The verdict was death. The blade that ends such trials is not symbolic to the condemned. It is merely exact. The head traveled because it had to. Some acts are cruel in order to be legible. In Benin City, courtiers do not need explanations when a sealed chest is set where the lamps make the bronze glint harder. Messages arrive in many registers, parchment, rumor, tribute, and some arrive as silence that no one interrupts. The court recorded the obedience of the commanders. Scribes inscribed the terms that would follow. A priest spoke the rites that fence off vengeance from justice and prevent the dead from multiplying themselves. Victory kept a ledger of its own. On the road home, the Ologbosir faltered. People say natural causes because it makes a story cleaner. What they mean is that a man who had been iron for too long met the softness that waits for iron after its work. He was buried near Okamwan, by headwaters some call Orogodo, with the quiet honors owed to a pillar taken from a building that still stands. The Ezomo did not keep his triumph long. Smallpox, the old democratic enemy, found him, and the throne that had praised him a week earlier now mourned him with the same precision with which it had praised. Imran returned to court alone. There is a particular way a single surviving hammer rests against a wall, as if it knows the next job will be heavier for the tools that are missing. In Akure, the counting began. People, cattle, jars, silences. A city learns itself anew after it has been rewritten by other hands. Tribute would follow slaves, ivory, coral, and with it the rituals of acknowledgement that bind a vassal to a center. Those are the mechanics. The meaning moves slower. Children who had watched a drum pattern turn their streets into a verdict would grow up knowing that a ritual can be a frontier, that to touch certain symbols is to be answered by maps and iron. In Benin, the court added a lesson to its long memory. Prestige affirmed is not immunity granted. Power is most itself when it does not pretend to be gentle, but even then it pays sometimes not on the field, but on the road home, or in the fever that visits a commander who has run out of glory to spend. Call it justice, call it overreach. The break and the blade always come wrapped in reasons that sound like law to the men who wield them and like fate to the men who receive them. Between those two sounds, empires raise their banners, and towns bury their dead. Mourning after conquest is made of lists. Names of the taken, names of the spared, cattle tallied, jars counted, courtyards swept of ash. What looks like silence is really administration assembling itself. In Akure, that silence learned the new grammar of power quickly. Tribute was specified in nouns that do not need adjectives. Slaves, ivory, coral, and in the intervals by which they must leave the city and arrive in Benin City without excuse. Vassalage was not a metaphor or a mood. It was a schedule, a ledger, a ritual of homage repeated until even memory bowed its head. The terms traveled with the same severity that had carried the guns. Messengers read them in the palace that was no longer a fortress but a counting house. Scribes inked them into books that would be checked against the seasons. The first caravans moved like corrections men and materials submitted to the road that led inevitably back to the Oba's court. There, Oba Osemwende received what law had ordered, not with triumph but with the ceremonial economy that makes empires durable. A priestly chant to balance the scales, a registrar's hand steady over the page, a reminder to the audience that punishment had concluded and order Benin's order had resumed. But campaigns seldom end where the terms are written. They end where pressure is maintained. To that purpose, the kingdom planted a hinge at Otun and named it a base, placing Imade and Oyodo at its center. Forward positions are more than huts and posts. They are ways of paying attention. From Otun, small detachments visited towns that had listened too closely to Akure's former defiance. They inspected roads, counted market days, checked the reliability of oaths. Tribute is not gathered only by porters. It is gathered by routines that make resistance expensive and delay unthinkable. With Otun as the fist's knuckle, pressure turned east into Ekiti, and chiefs who had weighed their options before now measured them against a nearer fact. Akure adjusted as cities do when the outer world rearranges their spine. New intermediaries rose, men who could speak Benin's idiom and Akure's pain in the same breath, and learned to balance obedience with dignity without dropping either. Festivals that had always begun with prayers to local ancestors now added a petition for peace on the road to Benin City, because tribute not waylaid is a kind of mercy. The market grew cautious, then practical, then busy again. Children were born into a street plan that felt inevitable to them and intolerable to their grandparents. This is how a verdict becomes a generation, not by edict alone, but by the ordinary resuming under altered rules. In Benin City, the court did not mistake triumph for immunity. The deaths of the Ologbozori, near Okamuan, and the Ezomo to smallpox traveled through the palace as a second lesson. Victory writes headlines, cost writes history. Their names received the honors reserved for pillars removed from a building that still stands, the careful rites, the bronze lamps, the roll call of deeds that keeps a state's memory from becoming only a list of taxes. Imiran, returning alone, presented a ledger that balanced in its columns and bled in its margins. Power took note. It always does. What then remained after the accounts? Symbols and the arguments they carry. In Edo retellings, the envoy's person is inviolable, his ivy, coral, and odigba torque extensions of the Oba himself. The punishment that follows their violation is less choice than consequence. In Akure's voice, a different emphasis rises. The sound of a quarter breaking, the humiliation of a palace laid open, the memory of a ruler, Deji Arákàlẹ, taken to the edge of the map and erased. Between them walk scholars and griots who try to reconcile documents and drums. Some traditions say the routes that closed the ring ran a slightly different course. Others hold that the number of field guns has been magnified by time. The precise role of the Deji in the night's provocation sits in a penumbra where law and pride shadow one another. The divergences matter. They are proof that power leaves not one story but several, and that honesty requires living with the friction between them. Memory took root in smaller ways, too. A proverb hardened around the offense: do not bruise the breath that carries a king's words. Mothers coined their own proverbs for children with quick hands. Not every shining thing is yours to touch. Drummers learned the cadence by which an encirclement announces itself. In later years, a single bar of it could still make a courtyard still itself. The path through Isinkan and the lanes of Isolo became geography with an ache in it. Even when time gentled the houses, a crack in plaster could look, to the old, like a map line rediscovered. And because power is never merely military, its shadow lengthened through administration and faith. The annual appearance of tribute at court became an act of political worship, proof that order prevailed from coast to savannah. In Akure, the opposite ritual unfolded in private libations, poured for those whose names did not make it into ledgers, a whispered oath to keep the city's center from forgetting its edges. Law says one thing, longing says another. Most societies survive by letting both speak and refusing to let either shout. The forward base at Otun did its work too well to be noticed from year to year. The absence of revolt can feel like peace when what it really is the success of vigilance. And yet, beneath the efficiency, the memory that remains kept breathing. It breathed in the caution with which captains taught new recruits to watch for rings tightening on a map. It breathed in merchants' habit of counting the road guards twice before setting out. It breathed in the careful way a city held its own rituals, as if they were bowls carried across a threshold that had once been swept hard by strangers. In the end, the legacy of the campaign is twofold. On one side, a restored hierarchy tribute moving on time, a forward base that extended Benin's reach. a lesson inscribed in the conduct of towns from Ado Ekiti to Uhen. Do not mistake patience for softness. On the other, a stubborn, complicated memory of law that arrived wearing the face of iron, of sovereignty recalculated, of stories that refuse to agree and therefore continue to mean. Call it justice, call it overreach. The truth that survives is less a verdict than a mirror. Touch certain symbols and the world will answer, accept certain terms and the world will keep its distance. Between those answers and that distance, people made lives, told tales, and taught their children the shape of caution. And far away, in a court that had weighed prestige against mortality and chosen both, the lamps burned steady over ledgers that closed on time. History remembers the Benin Akure War of 1818 as the day white turned red. A ritual of renewal orhue chalk carried by Chief Oseg to confirm Oba Osemwende's accession should have sealed an old bond. By nightfall, the envoy lay dead and his ivy coral and odigba torque were seized inside Akure. Whether a spontaneous brawl or a provoked trap, the line was crossed. In Benin law, the envoy embodies the sovereign's breath. Osemwende answered with design, not rage. He tasked the Ezomo, the Ologbozere, and Imaran, with Imade and Oyodo scouting ahead, to conduct a three-axis encirclement. The plan was simple, severe, and professional. Close the roads, deny supplies, then apply shock where it would break will, not just walls. Around Isinkun and the quarter of Isolo, field guns accounts differ on numbers spoke the language of inevitability. Akure's defenders tightened, then thinned. The palace skin of sovereignty trembled under impact. Deji Arákàlẹ fled toward Ado Ekiti and was refused sanctuary, then reached Uhen, where prudence prevailed and word went to the Ezomo. A swift tribunal followed. The Deji was executed. His head sent to Benin City a message legible to friends and rivals alike. Victory, however, kept its own ledger. The Ologbozere died en route near Okamwan by the headwaters called Orogodo. The Ezomo succumbed to smallpox soon after. Imaran returned alone to receive the Oba's thanks. The political settlement was cold and clear. Akure reduced to vassal status, tribute in slaves, ivory, and coral set to schedule. A forward base planted at Otun under Imade and Oyodo to project pressure into Ekiti. Markets reopened under altered rules. Intermediaries learned to speak both Benin's law and Akure's pain. Children grew up with a drum pattern that once announced a ring closing. Memory, meanwhile, refused to be uniform. Edo retellings read the expedition as lawful punishment for an inviolable offense. Akure voices keep the humiliation of a broken quarter, and a ruler erased at the edge of the map. Scholars mark the places where sources disagree routes. Artillery, the Deji's role in the fracas, because power rarely leaves a single story behind. What does this leave us? First, symbols are not just symbols. Touch the wrong one and you don't trigger a quarrel. You trigger a system. Second, strategy beats bravado. Encirclement, logistics, patience, and precise shock accomplish what noise cannot. Third, power has a price column sometimes paid not in battle, but on the road home. Finally, memory is part of the aftermath. How a community tells the story shapes what it dares next. In our lives now, the applications are practical. Treat institutions and emissaries from whistleblowers to mediators as sacred infrastructure. Resolve crises with design, not anger. Map the problem, close the bad exits, and apply pressure where it changes behavior, not where it merely satisfies pride. Protect your legitimacy with care for sequence and sign timing, process, consent. In victory, practice humility, count the unseen costs, and avoid planting resentments that will demand interest later. Quick question, drop your pick in the comments. A. After the envoy was killed, should Oba Osemwende have led with sanctions and diplomacy before any march? B. Or was a rapid, rule-driven, punitive expedition the necessary answer to protect the system? What's your take on the ethics and strategy of this campaign? Justice, overreach, or something in between? Share your view so others can learn from it. And if you want more African power stories told with care and fire, subscribe. Your support is the fuel that brings the next one to life.